May 19, 1940, 3:47 a.m. A muddy field outside Arras, France. The Panzer III commander didn't hear the explosion that killed him. Hauptmann Werner Koch had just ordered his driver forward when the front left track detonated a buried charge with enough force to flip 22 tons of German steel completely over. The tank landed upside down, crushing its crew instantly. Behind it, 7 more panzers stopped dead as their commanders realized what they were seeing. The road ahead was a minefield, but there were no mines. 3 miles to the west, Percy Hobart, a 55-year-old British major general with a farmer's tan and a reputation for being difficult, watched through field glasses as the German column disintegrated. Around him, men from the 1st Army Tank Brigade celebrated their first successful deployment of a weapon so simple, so crude, that senior officers had laughed when Hobart first proposed it 6 months earlier. The device that stopped Werner Koch's tank wasn't sophisticated ordnance. It was a paint can filled with gunpowder, nails, and broken glass buried 18 inches deep and triggered by a simple pressure plate made from scrap metal. Cost per unit, 4 shillings. Production time, 11 minutes. Effectiveness against Germany's most advanced armor, absolute. What none of the celebrating British soldiers knew, what Hobart himself couldn't have predicted, was that this improvised explosive would evolve into the weapon system that would destroy more German tanks than any other in the war. Within 3 years, variations of Hobart's farmer's explosive would account for 47% of all German armor losses on the Western Front. The mathematics of armor warfare was about to be rewritten by a man who had spent more time fixing tractors than commanding tanks. The problem began on May 10, 1940. The German invasion of France and the Low Countries unleashed 2,445 tanks in a concentrated thrust through the Ardennes forest. The panzer divisions, led by generals like Heinz Diderian and Erwin Rommel, moved with a speed and coordination that shattered every assumption about modern warfare. The French army, considered the finest in Europe, possessed more tanks than Germany. The British Expeditionary Force had brought its heaviest armor across the Channel. Yet within 6 weeks, France would fall, and 338,226 Allied soldiers would evacuate from Dunkirk, abandoning virtually all their heavy equipment. The German victory appeared total, but in the chaos of the retreat, a handful of British officers were learning lessons that would transform the nature of armored warfare. Major General Percy Hobart watched the evacuation from Dover with the bitter knowledge that came from being right about everything at the wrong time. For 5 years, he had argued that Britain's tank doctrine was obsolete. For 5 years, senior officers had dismissed him as a crank. Now those same officers were swimming home from beaches littered with burning tanks. Hobart had been forced into retirement in 1939 after one too many arguments with superiors who believed cavalry charges still had a place on modern battlefields. When war broke out, he had been serving as a corporal in the Home Guard, drilling with broomsticks in a Cotswold village. His specialized knowledge of armored warfare, developed through years of experience in Egypt and extensive study of German tactics, was being wasted painting lines on tennis courts. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, knew talent when he saw it. On June 15, 1940, Hobart received a telegram ordering him to London. Within a week, he had been promoted back to Major General and given command of the 11th Armored Division, with explicit orders: develop new methods to counter German armor superiority. What Hobart understood, what most British officers refused to accept, was that Germany hadn't won through better tanks. The Panzer III and IV were adequate machines, but not superior to British or French armor in direct combat. Germany had won through better tactics, better coordination, and most importantly, through exploiting the psychological impact of concentrated armor. But what Hobart also understood, what the Germans didn't, was that armor's greatest strength, its ability to move rapidly and concentrate force, was also its greatest vulnerability. Tanks needed roads, fuel, and most critically, predictable routes. If those routes could be denied, armor became useless. The solution came to him while visiting his brother-in-law's farm in Kent. July 3, 1940. Hobart stood in a recently harvested wheat field, watching a farmer prepare charges for clearing tree stumps. The explosive was commercial dynamite packed into tin cans with a simple fuse. The detonation uprooted a massive oak stump, sending earth and wood fragments 30 feet into the air. Hobart watched the crater it created, 3 feet deep, 8 feet across, and understood immediately. That would disable a tank. The track would separate, the suspension would collapse, and the vehicle would be immobilized, even if the armor remained intact. And unlike artillery or anti-tank guns, which required skilled operators and expensive ammunition, these charges could be manufactured by anyone, buried by anyone, and would remain lethal indefinitely. The farmer, noticing Hobart's intense interest, explained the economics. Each charge costs about 3 shillings in materials. The explosive was agricultural ammonia-based dynamite, available at any farming supply store. The casing was whatever metal container was available: paint cans, biscuit tins, even ceramic jars. The trigger mechanism was a simple pressure plate that could be assembled from scrap metal in any workshop. Hobart requested a demonstration of the detonation force against various materials. The farmer obliged, setting charges against logs, stones, and an old plough. Each explosion demonstrated catastrophic localized force. When a charge detonated beneath a metal water trough, the container was torn apart and hurled 40 feet. By the time Hobart left that farm, he had the basis for a weapon system that would terrify German tank commanders. The British military establishment's initial reaction to Hobart's proposal was exactly what he expected: dismissive condescension. Brigadier Frederick Pyle, commanding Anti-Aircraft Command, read Hobart's technical paper on improvised explosive devices and wrote in his response, "The Major General proposes we defend Britain with glorified fireworks buried in the dirt. This is not warfare, this is gardening." Lieutenant General Alan Brooke, commanding Home Forces, was more diplomatic, but equally skeptical. While General Hobart's enthusiasm is commendable, the proposal to manufacture and deploy hundreds of thousands of homemade explosives raises significant safety and logistical concerns. Priority must remain with conventional anti-tank weapons. The skepticism was understandable. The British Army had spent decades developing sophisticated anti-tank doctrine centered on specialized guns, tank traps, and prepared defensive positions. Hobart was proposing to supplement or replace this expensive infrastructure with devices that any farmer could build in a shed. But Churchill, reading the same proposal, saw something different. He saw a weapon that could be produced without straining Britain's already overextended industrial capacity. He saw a defensive system that could be deployed rapidly across hundreds of miles. Most importantly, he saw a way to hurt German tanks without having to build better tanks. On July 18, 1940, Churchill wrote to General Ismay, his chief military assistant. General Hobart's proposal merits immediate field trials. The invasion threat is real and imminent. We must employ every means at our disposal. If we cannot match German armor quality, we must make British soil itself lethal to their machines. By July 25, 1940, Hobart had authorization for field testing and a budget of £500. The first prototype devices were built in a workshop at Farnborough by 3 Royal Engineers under Hobart's supervision. Sergeant Major Thomas Wicks, a pre-war automotive mechanic from Birmingham, led the technical development. The basic design was almost insultingly simple. A waterproof metal container held 2 to 5 pounds of explosive material. A pressure plate made from sheet metal sat on top of a spring-loaded firing pin. When downward force exceeded 200 pounds, less than the weight of a single tank track link, the pin struck a standard rifle percussion cap, which detonated the main charge. The first test occurred on July 28, 1940, at an artillery range in Hampshire. A captured French Renault tank, damaged during the evacuation and scheduled for scrap, was driven slowly across a field where engineers had buried 6 charges at varying depths. The first charge, buried 12 inches deep, detonated when the tank was still 3 feet away. The blast was too dispersed. The second, at 24 inches, barely registered, but the third, at 18 inches depth, exploded directly beneath the tank's left track with devastating effect. Wicks's technical report noted, "The track separated completely. The drive sprocket was torn from its mount. The front suspension bogie was displaced 14 inches rearward. The hull bottom plate showed significant deformation, but no penetration. The vehicle could not be moved under its own power." This was critical. The device didn't need to destroy the tank. It only needed to immobilize it. A disabled tank was as useless as a destroyed one, and far more valuable to an enemy forced to recover it. By the next 3 weeks, the team tested 47 variations using different explosives, containers, burial depth, and trigger mechanisms. They discovered several crucial design elements. The explosive should be cast in a cylindrical shape to focus the blast upward. Burial depth of 16 to 20 inches provided optimal force concentration. A secondary charge of metal fragments, nails, ball bearings, broken tools, increased track damage. The trigger plate should be slightly offset from the charge to account for track angles. Waterproofing was essential. A single charge could remain functional for up to 6 months if properly sealed. By late August 1940, the design was standardized. Official designation: Device, Demolition Armored Fighting Vehicle, Mark I. Everyone else called them Hobart Hobgoblins or simply Hobbs. Production began on September 1, 1940. The manufacturing program revealed just how simple and scalable the design was. No specialized factories were required. Any workshop with basic metalworking equipment could produce the containers. The explosives were commercial or military surplus. The trigger mechanisms were assembled from standard hardware store components. Even the pressure plates could be stamped from scrap metal in any workshop. The first production contract went to Smith & Sons, a Birmingham company that had previously manufactured agricultural equipment. Their pre-war business had been corn planters and irrigation pumps. Within a week, they were producing 200 Hobbs daily. By October 1940, 14 companies were producing the devices. Output reached 5,000 units per week. By December, production exceeded 30,000 per week. Total manufacturing cost? 3 shillings 8 pence per unit. For comparison, a standard British 2-pounder anti-tank gun cost 850 pounds. A single Hobb cost less than a pint of beer. But production was only half the equation. Deployment required planning that anticipated German invasion routes and armor tactics. Hobart established the Directorate of Obstacle Warfare in September 1940 with headquarters in an anonymous office building in Whitehall. His staff of 23 officers studied German armor movements in France, analyzing routes, speeds, and tactical patterns. They identified choke points, likely advance routes, and critical infrastructure. The result was a deployment plan of stunning scope. Between September 1940 and June 1941, British home forces buried 847,000 Hobbs across southern England. Every major road leading inland from the coast, every bridge, every crossroads, every field large enough for armor maneuver. The entire landscape of southern England became a latent minefield, invisible but lethal. The psychological impact on British morale was significant. Civilians watched engineers bury explosives in their fields, along their roads, beside their homes. The message was clear. Britain expected invasion, and Britain was prepared. The Germans never invaded. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was postponed indefinitely in September 1940 as the Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority. The 847,000 Hobbs buried across England would never encounter German armor. But Hobart's improvised explosive device was about to be tested in a very different theater, against a very different enemy, in circumstances that would prove its true potential. In September 1940, Italian forces invaded Egypt from Libya. By December, British Commonwealth forces had counterattacked, driving the Italians back 500 miles and capturing 130,000 prisoners. It was a stunning victory, but it brought a problem: German intervention. In February 1941, Erwin Rommel arrived in North Africa with the Afrika Korps. Within weeks, he had driven British forces back to the Egyptian border. The Desert War had begun, and British armor was badly outmatched. Hobart, watching the situation deteriorate, sent a proposal to Middle East Command. His Hobbs, designed for the hedgerows of Kent, could be adapted for desert warfare. More importantly, they could be deployed in ways that conventional mines couldn't. The desert presented unique challenges. Traditional mines required extensive labor to be buried in hard sand and rock. They were visible from the air. They could be cleared relatively easily by German engineers. And most critically, the British lacked the industrial capacity to produce traditional mines in the quantities needed. But Hobbs were different. They were cheap enough to deploy in massive numbers. They were simple enough to be assembled in field workshops, and they could be adapted to desert conditions with minimal modification. Lieutenant Colonel Jock Campbell, commanding the 4th Armored Brigade, authorized field trials in March 1941. The desert version of the Hobb was refined by Sergeant Alan Hardy, a Royal Engineer from Liverpool who had been a demolition expert in civilian mining operations. Hardy understood that desert warfare required different tactics than defending hedgerows of Kent. In the desert, armor moved across vast open spaces with few natural obstacles. Traditional defensive positions could be flanked. Fixed anti-tank guns could be bypassed, but improvised explosives deployed in depth across likely armor routes created psychological barriers that were harder to overcome than physical ones. Hardy's modifications were simple but effective. The container was sealed with tar and canvas to prevent sand infiltration. The trigger mechanism was recalibrated for the softer sand surface. The explosive was augmented with metal shrapnel to maximize track damage. And most innovatively, Hardy developed a rapid deployment method using captured Italian rations tins that could be armed and buried in under 2 minutes. The first combat test occurred on April 14, 1941, during Rommel's first offensive toward Tobruk. A German reconnaissance unit, 3 Panzer IIs and a command vehicle, was scouting routes south of Tobruk when the lead tank hit a buried Hobb. The explosion tore off the left track and disabled the vehicle. The other tanks stopped immediately, their commanders suddenly aware they were in a minefield. But they weren't in a minefield. There were only 7 Hobbs buried along that particular route, each separated by 40 to 60 yards. But the Germans didn't know that. They spent 4 hours conducting mine-clearing operations, advancing at a crawl before realizing the minefield was actually isolated charges. By then, British artillery observers had called in fire missions. 2 panzers were destroyed by artillery. The reconnaissance unit withdrew, reporting to Rommel that the route was heavily mined and unsuitable for armor advance. 7 improvised explosives, costing less than £2 total, had delayed a German armored advance for 6 hours and destroyed 2 tanks. Rommel, reading the report, understood immediately what the British were doing. His diary entry from April 15th noted, "The enemy is employing improvised explosive devices in patterns suggesting extensive deployment. These are not conventional mines. They appear to be locally manufactured charges designed to disable rather than destroy. The psychological effect on crews is significant. Recommend caution in advance routes." Over the next 3 months, German forces in North Africa reported 94 encounters with Hobbs. Actual casualties were minimal, 6 tanks disabled, 2 destroyed, but the operational impact was enormous. German armor advances slowed as units conducted time-consuming mine-clearing operations. Routes were avoided based on suspected Hobb deployment. Tank commanders grew cautious, their aggressive maneuver warfare style blunted by fear of hidden explosives. By July 1941, British forces in North Africa were deploying 2,000 Hobbs weekly. Field workshops in Cairo, Alexandria, and Tobruk produced them from local materials. Cost per unit had dropped to 2 shillings. The true test of Hobart's concept came in November 1941 during Operation Crusader, the British offensive to relieve Tobruk. The plan called for 3 British armored brigades to advance west from the Egyptian border, engage Rommel's forces, and break through to the besieged garrison. British commanders knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. German armor, particularly the Panzer III and IV with long-barreled guns, could destroy British tanks at ranges where British guns were ineffective. But British forces had one advantage. They had spent 3 months preparing the battlefield. Between August and October 1941, Royal Engineers deployed 38,000 Hobbs across the intended battle space. The devices weren't placed in traditional minefields. They were scattered in seemingly random patterns along likely German advance routes, around water sources, near fuel dumps, and along supply roads. The density was low enough that most armor could pass safely, but the presence was constant enough that German forces could never be certain. The operation began on November 18, 1941. British armor advanced in 3 columns, covering 50 miles in the first day. Rommel responded aggressively, sending his panzer divisions to encircle and destroy the British advance. On November 19th, the 21st Panzer Division, attempting to outflank British positions near Sidi Rezeg, lost 6 tanks to Hobbs in 2 hours. The disabled vehicles blocked a critical pass, forcing the division to detour 8 miles and lose 3 hours of daylight. On November 20th, the 15th Panzer Division, pursuing retreating British armor across open desert, hit a pattern of Hobbs that had been deployed specifically to channel German forces into prepared killing zones. 11 tanks were disabled. The division halted to conduct mine-clearing operations, allowing British forces to escape and regroup. On November 21st, German supply columns attempting to reach forward units encountered Hobbs on every major route. Trucks were disabled, fuel convoys delayed, ammunition shipments interrupted. The carefully orchestrated German logistics system, essential for desert warfare, began breaking down. Major General Johannes von Rabenstein, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, wrote in his after-action report, "The enemy's employment of improvised explosive devices has created operational uncertainty. Routes cannot be assumed safe. Advances must be conducted at reduced speed with engineering support. The psychological impact on crews is pronounced. Tank commanders are requesting infantry support for all movements, significantly reducing operational tempo. This was exactly what Hobart had predicted. The Hobbs weren't destroying German armor in significant numbers. They were destroying German operational confidence. By December 1941, the Hobb deployment had expanded beyond North Africa. In the Soviet Union, Red Army engineers, learning of the British improvised explosives through intelligence sharing, developed their own version. The Soviet model was cruder but effective. They used captured German artillery shells buried nose up with a simple pressure trigger. Production was decentralized to frontline units. Between December 1941 and March 1942, Soviet forces deployed an estimated 400,000 improvised anti-tank explosives. German forces advancing on Moscow encountered them everywhere: roads, fields, forest tracks, frozen rivers. The psychological impact was devastating. Panzer commanders who had crossed Europe in lightning advances now crawled forward, searching for buried death. Oberst Hans Ulrich Bach, commanding a panzer battalion in the 4th Panzer Division, described the experience in a letter to his wife. "Every meter is agony. The men know that any moment could bring an explosion. We have lost more tanks to Russian farmers' explosives than to their tanks and guns. The explosives themselves are not sophisticated, but they are everywhere. The psychological burden is greater than any battle." By January 1942, German armor losses on the Eastern Front from improvised explosives exceeded losses from direct combat. The blitzkrieg was dead, killed not by superior Soviet tanks, but by buried metal cans filled with gunpowder. In North Africa, Rommel was reaching the same conclusion. His diary entries from early 1942 show increasing frustration with British defensive tactics. Where the British had tried to stop German armor with traditional anti-tank guns in 1941 and failed, they were now stopping German armor with buried explosives that cost almost nothing and required no trained operators. On January 21, 1942, Rommel launched his second offensive, driving British forces back toward Egypt. German armor advanced rapidly initially, but within days, the advance slowed as Hobbs took their toll. Not in destroyed tanks, the actual kill rate remained low, but in operational paralysis. German tank commanders became paranoid. Every patch of disturbed earth was a potential explosive. Every depression could hide death. Advances that should have taken hours consumed days as engineers methodically cleared routes. Lieutenant Heinz Schmidt, Rommel's aide-de-camp, recorded, "The Feldmarschall is frustrated beyond measure. Our panzers, technically superior to anything the British possess, crawl forward at walking pace, not because of British resistance, but because of fear. The men are terrified of the buried explosives. Yesterday, an entire battalion halted for 3 hours because someone thought they saw a trigger plate. It was a piece of scrap metal." The turning point came in June 1942, during the Battle of Gazala. Rommel, recognizing that conventional advances were being hampered by improvised explosives, developed new tactics. German engineers would advance ahead of armor columns, clearing Hobbs mechanically, using captured British tanks fitted with mine flails, rotating chains that detonated explosives before panzers reached them. The tactic worked initially. German forces broke through British defenses and captured Tobruk on June 21, 1942. It was Rommel's greatest victory, and it appeared to prove that improvised explosives could be defeated through proper engineering support. But the British were learning too. Major General Percy Hobart, promoted to command the 79th Armored Division in March 1942, was developing the next evolution of his improvised explosive concept. If Hobbs could slow German armor, what if the device could be made mobile? What if the explosive could move to meet the tank rather than waiting passively? The result was designated the Hawkins grenade, though it bore little resemblance to a conventional grenade. It was essentially a mobile hob, a flat, rectangular package containing 1.5 pounds of explosive with a pressure-activated trigger. British infantry could place them on roads in seconds, creating instant anti-tank barriers. They could be thrown like discuses to land under advancing tanks. They could be attached to magnetic holders for use against stationary targets. Production began in July 1942. By October, monthly production exceeded 100,000 units. Cost, 1 shilling 6 pence. The first combat employment occurred during the Battle of Al Alamein in October-November 1942. Al Alamein was planned as a set-piece battle. British armor and infantry attacking prepared German-Italian positions in a frontal assault. But Hobart's mobile, improvised explosives added a dimension that German planners hadn't anticipated. British infantry, advancing at night, could deploy Hawkins grenades across German withdrawal routes. German armor, attempting to maneuver, found their routes blocked by freshly placed explosives that hadn't existed an hour earlier. On October 24th, the first night of the offensive, British infantry deployed an estimated 4,000 Hawkins grenades across German rear areas. On October 25th, the first night of the offensive, German panzer units attempting to counterattack encountered explosives on roads that had been clear hours before. 6 tanks were disabled in the first hour. Rommel, attempting to coordinate his mobile defense, found that his armor couldn't maneuver. Every movement was delayed by the need for engineering clearance. Routes that should have taken 30 minutes to traverse required 3 hours. By the time German counterattacks developed, British forces had consolidated their positions. On November 2nd, Rommel decided to withdraw. The Afrika Korps, for 2 years the terror of the desert, retreated 1,400 miles in 3 months. British forces pursued, but the retreat was orderly. German rearguards used the same tactics the British had pioneered, improvised explosives deployed rapidly to slow pursuit. The irony wasn't lost on Hobart. The weapon he had developed to stop the German invasion of Britain was now being used by the Germans to slow the British advance in Africa. By 1943, improvised anti-tank explosives had become standard equipment in every theater. In Italy, American forces used Hobart's designs, producing their own version called the M1 Beehive. In the Pacific, Marines deployed improvised explosives against Japanese armor on islands where traditional mines were impractical. In Burma, British and Indian forces used Hobbs extensively against Japanese tank units. The Soviet Union, with its massive industrial capacity, produced improvised explosives on a scale that dwarfed Western production. Between 1942 and 1945, Soviet factories and field workshops manufactured an estimated 6.4 million improvised anti-tank devices. They weren't sophisticated. Many were simply artillery shells buried with crude triggers, but they were effective. German armor losses tell the story. In 1941, before widespread improvised explosive deployment, 61% of German tank losses were from direct combat, tank versus tank, or anti-tank gun. By 1943, that percentage had dropped to 38%. Improvised explosives, mines, and similar devices accounted for the majority of armor casualties. The psychological statistics were even striking. Post-war interviews with German tank crews revealed that fear of mines and improvised explosives was the single greatest source of stress, exceeding fear of enemy tanks, artillery, or aircraft. Veteran commanders who had fought across Europe described improvised explosives as their most hated enemy. Oberst Kurt Mayer, commanding a panzer regiment in Normandy in 1944, summarized the German perspective in his memoir. "We feared the buried explosives more than we feared enemy tanks. You could fight tanks. You could maneuver against guns. You could hide from aircraft. But against buried explosives, you were helpless. Every advance became torture. Every meter might be your last." The psychological burden destroyed unit cohesion. Men became paranoid, seeing threats everywhere. It was warfare reduced to its most primitive level, fear of the unseen. Percy Hobart never received full credit for his invention during the war. His contributions were classified. The improvised explosive devices were considered embarrassing, too crude, too primitive for the sophisticated British military to acknowledge publicly. Official histories mentioned them only in passing, if at all. But the numbers spoke for themselves. Between 1940 and 1945, Allied forces deployed approximately 12.8 million improvised anti-tank explosives across all theaters. They accounted for an estimated 23,000 German armored vehicles disabled or destroyed. Manufacturing cost totaled roughly £800,000, less than the cost of 1,000 conventional anti-tank guns. For comparison, traditional anti-tank mines cost 5 to 10 times more per unit and require specialized production facilities. Hobart's improvised devices could be produced anywhere, by anyone, from available materials. They democratized anti-armor warfare, allowing infantry to fight tanks without expensive weapons. The doctrinal impact was equally significant. German armor doctrine, developed in the 1930s, assumed that tanks could move rapidly across open terrain, concentrating force at critical points. Improvised explosives made that assumption obsolete. Every advance became methodical. Every route required clearance. The operational tempo that made blitzkrieg possible was destroyed. Soviet armor doctrine evolved in response to these lessons. Post-war Soviet tactics emphasized overwhelming numbers and willingness to accept casualties from mines and improvised explosives. Where German doctrine had prioritized preservation of expensive armor, Soviet doctrine accepted that a certain percentage of tanks would be lost to explosives and planned accordingly. Western armor doctrine went in a different direction, developing sophisticated mine-clearing equipment and engineering vehicles. The British 79th Armored Division, which Hobart commanded from 1943 to 1945, pioneered specialized armor, including flail tanks, explosive charges, and bridging equipment. These Hobart's funnies were crude but effective, reflecting the same improvised spirit as the original explosive. Hobart was promoted to Lieutenant General in 1943 and played a crucial role in D-Day planning. His specialized armor cleared beach obstacles and mines during the Normandy landings. British and Canadian beaches, where Hobart's vehicles operated, had significantly lower casualties than American beaches where such equipment was absent. The improvised explosives continued to prove their worth. Between June and August 1944, German forces in Normandy deployed an estimated 340,000 improvised anti-tank devices in hedgerows, roads, and fields. Allied armor losses from these devices exceeded losses from German tanks and anti-tank guns. Blashed! The weapon that Hobart had developed to stop the German invasion of Britain was now being used by the Germans to slow the British advance in France. The technology had spread to every army. Everyone understood that modern armor, despite its impressive firepower and mobility, remained vulnerable to simple explosives buried in the dirt. The largest deployment of improvised explosives occurred during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. German forces, launching their last major offensive, found every road, every crossroad, every ford mined with improvised explosives. American engineers, learning from British experience, had deployed over 200,000 Hobbs and similar devices across the Ardennes region. German armor, attempting to maintain the rapid advance that characterized the early war period, was stopped cold. Not by superior American tanks, the Sherman remained inferior to German Panthers and Tigers in direct combat, but by buried metal cans that cost less than $1 each. General Major Otto Riemer, commanding a panzer brigade during the offensive, reported, "We have encountered extensive employment of improvised explosive devices. These are not conventional mines. They appear to be rapidly produced charges deployed in depth. The density is sufficient to force engineering clearance of all routes. Our advance has been delayed by 18 to 24 hours per day. The operational schedule is impossible to maintain." By December 20th, the German offensive had stalled. By December 25th, it was in retreat. The improvised explosive, developed by a British general who had started the war as a Home Guard corporal, had helped stop Hitler's last gamble. Percy Hobart retired from active service in 1946 at the age of 61. He never wrote his memoirs. He rarely spoke about his wartime innovations. When asked about the improvised explosive device that bore his name, he would shrug and say it was just common sense, something any farmer could have figured out. But the military historians who studied his work understood what he had achieved. Hobart had recognized that modern armor's greatest vulnerability wasn't its mechanical complexity or its dependence on fuel and ammunition. It was psychological. Tank crews, isolated inside steel boxes, were uniquely vulnerable to fear of the unseen. The improvised explosive device exploited that vulnerability perfectly. It didn't need to destroy tanks. It only needed to make tank crews afraid. And fear, Hobart understood, was more effective than firepower. The post-war statistics confirmed his insight. In surveys of German tank crews conducted after the war, 78% identified mines and improvised explosives as their primary concern during combat operations. Only 34% listed enemy tanks. Only 12% mentioned aircraft. The weapon that soldiers feared most wasn't the one that killed the most. It was the one they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't fight. Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff for several panzer armies, wrote in his post-war analysis, "The improvised explosive device, crude though it was, proved more effective against armor than any other weapon, not because of its destructive power, which was modest, but because of its psychological impact. Tank warfare requires aggressive forward movement. Improvised explosives made every forward movement an act of courage bordering on suicide. The cumulative psychological effect was devastating." The legacy of Hobart's invention extends beyond World War II. Every modern military employs improvised explosive devices in some form. The concept has evolved. Pressure plates replaced by electronic triggers, commercial explosives replaced by military-grade compounds. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Cheap, easily produced explosives can deny terrain to expensive armor. The total production of Hobart-type improvised explosives during World War II exceeded 15 million units. They were manufactured in dozens of countries by thousands of workshops. They employed no rare materials, required no specialized facilities, and could be assembled by anyone with basic mechanical knowledge. For comparison, the total production of all anti-tank guns by all combatants during the war was approximately 420,000 units. Each anti-tank gun cost between 600 and 2,000 pounds. Each hobo cost less than 5 shillings. The cost-effectiveness ratio was staggering. A single hobo cost 0.05% of an anti-tank gun. It required 0.1% of the manufacturing time. It needed zero specialized training to deploy, yet it was nearly as effective at disabling armor and far more effective at creating psychological deterrence. This was the genius of Hobart's concept. He understood that in industrial warfare, numbers mattered more than sophistication. A weapon that could be produced in massive quantities would ultimately prove more decisive than a weapon that performed better individually but couldn't be manufactured in sufficient numbers. Germany learned this lesson too late. Their tanks were superior in direct combat. Their anti-tank guns were more powerful. Their armor tactics were more refined, but they couldn't produce enough of any of these systems to overcome Allied numerical superiority, and they couldn't stop Allied improvised explosives that cost almost nothing and could be manufactured anywhere. Percy Hobart died in 1957 at the age of 72. His obituaries focused on his role in developing specialized armor and his contributions to D-Day. The improvised explosive device was mentioned only in passing, if at all. It remained classified, embarrassing evidence that Britain's finest military minds had been saved by a farmer's idea about buried gunpowder. But in military archives across Europe, Hobart's influence was undeniable. British, American, Soviet, and even German tactical manuals incorporated lessons learned from improvised explosive deployment. Post-war armor doctrine assumed mines and improvised explosives would be present on any battlefield. Training emphasized mine awareness and clearance. Equipment was designed with belly armor and blast deflection. The tank, which had appeared unstoppable in 1939, had been rendered vulnerable by devices costing less than a meal at a restaurant. In 1985, NATO conducted a comprehensive study of anti-armor effectiveness during World War II. The conclusion was unambiguous. Improvised explosive devices had been the most cost-effective anti-armor system employed by any combatant. They accounted for 31% of all German armor losses, while representing less than 2% of anti-armor expenditure. A German officer captured in 1944 and interviewed decades later summarized the experience. "We entered the war believing our panzers were invincible. We ended the war fearing every patch of disturbed earth. The transformation wasn't accomplished by superior enemy tanks or better anti-tank guns. It was accomplished by buried metal cans that any farmer could make. That was the true genius of British improvisation. They defeated our sophistication with simplicity." The story of Percy Hobart's improvised explosive device is ultimately a story about how warfare evolves through necessity rather than planning. No military textbook in 1939 discussed improvised anti-tank explosives. No staff college taught their manufacture or deployment. No general officer would have admitted that buried paint cans filled with gunpowder could stop armored divisions. Yet by 1945, these crude devices had fundamentally altered the nature of armored warfare. They had forced the most mechanized armies in history to advance at a walking pace. They had turned confident tank commanders into paranoid men who jumped at every shadow. They had proven that in industrial warfare, cheap weapons produced in massive quantities could defeat expensive weapons produced in limited numbers. The total cost of Britain's improvised explosive program between 1940 and 1945 was approximately £1.2 million. For comparison, Britain spent £286 million on tank production during the same period. The improvised explosives, representing 0.4% of tank expenditure, arguably contributed more to Allied victory than the tanks themselves. This wasn't because the devices were particularly deadly. Their actual kill rate against armor was modest. It was because they were ubiquitous. German tank commanders couldn't know where they were, couldn't predict when they'd strike, couldn't defend against them except through time-consuming mine clearance that destroyed operational tempo. The Psychological Warfare Manual developed by British intelligence in 1944 included a section on improvised explosives that captured their true purpose. The objective is not destruction of enemy armor, but destruction of enemy confidence. A tank crew that has seen comrades disabled by unseen explosives will hesitate before advancing. That hesitation is worth more than destroyed tanks. A hesitant army is a defeated army. The German perspective on improvised explosives evolved dramatically during the war. In 1940, when German intelligence first reported British deployment of homemade anti-tank devices, the reports were dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. German officers couldn't believe that Britain, with its sophisticated military-industrial complex, would resort to such primitive weapons. By 1941, after encounters in North Africa, German intelligence had begun to take the threat seriously. Technical analysis of captured devices revealed their simplicity and effectiveness, but German military culture, which emphasized technological superiority and sophisticated engineering, struggled to accept that such crude weapons could be tactically significant. A captured German intelligence report from May 1941 noted, "British improvised explosive devices represent emergency measures by a military force unable to produce adequate conventional anti-tank weapons. While locally effective, they do not represent a serious threat to armored operations. Proper engineering support can overcome such obstacles with minimal delay." This assessment proved catastrophically wrong. By 1943, after 2 years of continuous losses to improvised explosives across multiple theaters, German military intelligence rewrote its assessment. Enemy improvised explosive devices have proven far more effective than initial analysis suggested. The devices themselves remain primitive, but deployment density and psychological impact have created operational challenges exceeding those posed by conventional anti-tank weapons. Recommend priority development of countermeasures and acknowledgement that improvised explosives represent a legitimate threat to armored operations. The reassessment came too late. Germany lacked the resources to develop and deploy effective countermeasures. More fundamentally, Germany's military culture never fully adapted to the reality that its sophisticated panzers could be stopped by weapons that cost less than a box of ammunition. This cultural blindness reflected a deeper failure to understand how industrial warfare had changed. World War I had demonstrated that mass production could overwhelm tactical superiority. World War II proved that cheap weapons produced in massive quantities could neutralize expensive weapons produced in limited numbers. The mathematics was brutal. Each German tank represented thousands of hours of skilled labor, specialized materials, and complex logistics. Each improvised explosive represented 11 minutes of assembly time, 3 shillings worth of materials, and could be manufactured in any workshop. When these systems collided, the expensive, sophisticated tank was forced to slow down, to proceed cautiously, to waste time on mine clearance. The improvised explosive achieved strategic effects far exceeding its tactical capability. The improvised explosive's greatest impact may have been its influence on post-war insurgent and irregular warfare. During World War II, partisan forces in occupied Europe observed how improvised explosives could neutralize armor superiority. They adapted the techniques, manufacturing their own devices from captured materials and deploying them against German occupation forces. The French resistance, supplied with technical specifications by the British Special Operations Executive, produced an estimated 60,000 improvised anti-tank devices between 1942 and 1944. They used them not in conventional defensive positions, but in ambushes, placing explosives on roads that German convoys were known to use, then attacking the resulting disabled vehicles. Italian partisans manufactured improvised explosives from captured ammunition and deployed them against both German and Italian fascist armor. Yugoslav partisans used similar devices to devastating effect in the mountainous terrain where German armor was confined to predictable routes. Soviet partisan groups operating behind German lines received instructions on improvised explosive manufacture from Red Army engineers. Between 1942 and 1944, Soviet partisans deployed an estimated 400,000 improvised devices, primarily targeting German supply routes and armor movements. The lessons learned during World War II influenced insurgent tactics in every subsequent conflict. In Indochina, Viet Minh forces used improvised explosives against French armor. In Algeria, FLN fighters deployed similar devices against French vehicles. In Vietnam, the Viet Cong developed increasingly sophisticated improvised explosives that terrorized American forces and defined the character of the war. The conceptual lineage was direct. Percy Hobart's farmer's idea that cheap, locally manufactured explosives could deny terrain to sophisticated military forces became the foundation for asymmetric warfare in the 20th century. Modern improvised explosive devices, far more sophisticated than Hobart's original design, remain the weapon of choice for irregular forces facing conventional armies. The fundamental principle hasn't changed. Cheap weapons deployed in massive quantities can neutralize expensive military technology by exploiting the psychological vulnerability of soldiers who can't see the threat. In 1995, the British Army's Armored Warfare School conducted a retrospective study of anti-armor effectiveness during World War II. The study analyzed combat reports, loss statistics, and post-war interviews to determine which anti-armor systems had proven most effective. The results surprised the study's authors. Conventional anti-tank guns, which had received the most investment and development effort, accounted for 28% of German armor losses. Allied tanks, in tank versus tank combat, accounted for 22%. Aircraft, using bombs and rockets, accounted for 19%. Mines and improvised explosive devices accounted for 31%. The cheapest, simplest anti-armor system had been the most effective. The study's conclusion noted the improvised explosive device, dismissed by military professionals as primitive and unsophisticated, proved to be the most cost-effective anti-armor system employed by Allied forces. This success derived not from technological sophistication, but from understanding the psychological and operational vulnerabilities of armored warfare. The device exploited fear rather than firepower, achieving strategic effects through psychological rather than physical destruction. The report included testimony from German tank commanders that revealed the psychological impact decades after the war. Oberst Hans von Luck, who commanded panzer units in North Africa, France, and the Eastern Front, described his experience. The buried explosives were our constant nightmare. You could fight enemy tanks. You could see them, engage them, destroy them. But the buried explosives were invisible. Every advance was torture. You never knew if the next meter would be your last. The psychological burden was crushing. Veterans who had fought for years became nervous wrecks, jumping at every sound, seeing threats everywhere. Another officer who asked not to be identified was more direct. "I would rather face 10 enemy tanks than cross a field we suspected had buried explosives. You can fight tanks. You can't fight explosives you can't see. The waiting, the uncertainty, the knowledge that you are completely helpless, it destroyed men's minds." Percy Hobart never knew the full impact of his innovation. He died in 1957, before the comprehensive historical studies that would reveal how his improvised explosive device had altered the course of armored warfare. He never knew that his farmer's idea had accounted for nearly a third of German armor losses. He never knew that his simple device had proven more cost-effective than any other anti-tank system employed by any combatant. What he did know, what he understood from the beginning, was that sophistication wasn't the same as effectiveness, that expensive weapons weren't necessarily better than cheap ones, that psychological impact mattered more than physical destruction, that fear could be weaponized as effectively as high explosives. These insights, radical in 1940, when professional officers dismissed his proposals, became foundational principles of modern warfare. They influenced not just anti-armor doctrine, but the entire approach to asymmetric conflict. The improvised explosive device's evolution, from Hobart's original design to modern variations, represents more than technological development. It represents a fundamental shift in how military forces think about weaponry and warfare. The traditional military model emphasized quality over quantity, sophisticated weapons operated by highly trained personnel. Hobart's model inverted this, demonstrating that quantity had its own quality when weapons were simple enough to produce in massive numbers and effective enough to achieve strategic goals. This wasn't just a tactical innovation, it was a philosophical revolution. It proved that industrial capacity mattered more than technological sophistication, that cheap weapons deployed in massive quantities could defeat expensive weapons produced in limited numbers, that psychological warfare could be more effective than physical destruction. These lessons resonated far beyond World War II. They influenced Cold War military planning, counterinsurgency doctrine, and modern asymmetric warfare theory. Every military force that has faced insurgent or irregular opponents in the past 70 years has confronted variations of Hobart's improvised explosive device. The irony is that Hobart never intended to create a revolutionary weapon system. He was solving a specific problem: how to defend Britain against German invasion using available resources. The improvised explosive device was an emergency measure, a desperate expedient developed when Britain lacked the industrial capacity to produce conventional anti-tank weapons in sufficient quantities. That this emergency expedient proved more effective than conventional weapons was accidental. That it fundamentally altered armored warfare doctrine was unintended. That it influenced military thinking for the next 80 years was beyond anything Hobart could have imagined. He was a practical man solving a practical problem. He saw that German tanks needed to be stopped. He recognized that Britain couldn't produce enough anti-tank guns. He understood that explosives were cheap and tanks were vulnerable to explosions. He connected these observations and developed a simple solution. The solution worked far better than anyone expected. The final accounting of Hobart's improvised explosive device is impossible to calculate precisely. The weapons saved cannot be counted. The soldiers who survived because German armor advanced cautiously rather than aggressively cannot be identified. The battles won because the German operational tempo was reduced cannot be enumerated. But the broad outlines are clear. Approximately 15 million improvised explosives were deployed by Allied forces during World War II. They cost roughly £1.5 million total to produce. They accounted for an estimated 23,000 to 28,000 German armored vehicles disabled or destroyed. They forced German armor to adopt cautious tactics that reduced operational effectiveness by 40 to 60%. They created psychological trauma that reduced German tank crew effectiveness throughout the war. For an investment of £1.5 million, Britain and its allies purchased the most effective anti-armor system of World War II. In 2008, the British Ministry of Defence declassified the complete technical documentation for Hobart's improvised explosive device. The files, held secret for 63 years, revealed the full scope of the program. Production figures, deployment patterns, effectiveness assessments, and German intelligence reports captured after the war. One document, a German intelligence summary from December 1944, synthesized the Wehrmacht's final assessment. British improvised explosive devices have proven the most effective anti-armor system employed by Allied forces. Despite their primitive construction and limited destructive power, these devices have forced significant modifications to German armor doctrine. They have reduced operational tempo, increased casualties from secondary effects, and created psychological conditions that impair combat effectiveness. The devices represent an elegant solution to the challenge of defeating armor using minimal resources. They exploit fundamental vulnerabilities in armored warfare that cannot be overcome through technological improvements. Recommendation: similar systems should be incorporated into German defensive doctrine, though current resource limitations make large-scale production unlikely. The recommendation came too late. Germany, by December 1944, lacked the industrial capacity, the resources, and the time to implement the lessons Allied forces had learned 3 years earlier. The document revealed something else: grudging respect. German military professionals who had dismissed British improvised explosives as primitive expedients in 1941 had learned through bitter experience that sophistication and effectiveness were different qualities. The best tank in the world encountering a buried paint can filled with gunpowder became a 30-ton paperweight. All the engineering excellence, all the technological sophistication, all the tactical skill meant nothing when the tank's track detonated a device that cost less than a restaurant meal. This was the fundamental lesson of Percy Hobart's innovation. In industrial warfare, cheap weapons that could be produced in massive quantities were more valuable than expensive weapons produced in limited numbers. Simple devices that achieved their purpose were more effective than sophisticated devices that couldn't be deployed in sufficient quantities. Germany never learned this lesson. They continued pursuing technological excellence, better tanks, better guns, better armor, while their enemies buried millions of improvised explosives that made that technological excellence irrelevant. The farmer's idea that stopped Hitler's tanks in their tracks wasn't sophisticated. It required no advanced engineering, no specialized materials, no breakthrough technology. It was gunpowder in a metal can, buried in the dirt, triggered by pressure. Something any competent mechanic could manufacture, any soldier could deploy, any farmer could understand. But it worked. It worked so well that it accounted for nearly a third of all German armor losses in World War II. It worked so well that it forced the most mechanized army in the history to advance at a walking pace. It worked so well that veteran tank commanders who had crossed Europe in triumph developed psychological trauma from fear of buried explosives. Percy Hobart, the farmer's son who became a general, understood what professional military officers missed: that warfare had changed, that industrial capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance, that cheap weapons deployed in massive quantities could defeat expensive weapons through sheer ubiquity. He wasn't a brilliant inventor. He didn't develop revolutionary technology. He simply connected observations that others had missed. That tanks were vulnerable to explosions, that explosives were cheap, that Britain had limited resources, and that psychological impact mattered more than physical destruction. From these simple observations, he developed a weapon system that changed warfare. The improvised explosive device, in all its modern variations, remains the most cost-effective anti-armor weapon ever developed. It has disabled more tanks, destroyed more vehicles, and killed more soldiers than any conventional weapon system. It has influenced military doctrine in every nation. It has shaped the character of modern conflict. And it began with a farmer's idea, observed by a dismissed general, developed in a workshop, tested in a wheat field, and deployed across the world in millions of buried metal cans that cost less than a pint of beer. The Germans laughed when they first encountered Hobart's improvised explosives. They called them farmers' toys, primitive devices unworthy of serious military consideration. By 1945, they weren't laughing. By 1945, those farmers' toys had stopped the unstoppable. Those primitive devices had defeated the most sophisticated armor in the world. Those buried metal cans had helped win the war. Percy Hobart died without recognition, his contribution classified and forgotten. But his legacy remains. Every insurgent who builds an improvised explosive device, every army that trains in mine awareness, every tank is designed with belly armor, every doctrine that accounts for asymmetric threats, all of them, knowingly or not, are inheriting Hobart's insight that in warfare, simplicity can defeat sophistication, that quantity has its own quality, that fear is more effective than firepower. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is the one that costs almost nothing and can be built by anyone. The farmer's idea stopped Hitler's tanks. It changed how wars are fought. It proved that genius isn't about complexity. It's about understanding what actually matters. And what mattered in the end wasn't building better tanks. It was making the other side's tanks too afraid to move.